Hey guys, Will Tipton here, making a video for HUSNG.com. So unlike in my video pack where I talked about sort of advanced theoretical topics, today I'm just going to be making sort of a standard play video where I review hand histories from some games I played on the Revolution Network and explain my thought processes. So I actually just recently opened up an account on Black Chip Poker, and I got a little money on there, and it actually wasn't easy. Hopefully it's easier for the fish, or else those games aren't looking so good. But anyway, I got some money on here, and I haven't really played on here at all yet. I played a few micro stakes games just to get my HUD set up and whatnot. But basically, I'm coming into these games about as readless as you ever can. So my plan is to get a few games versus maybe some fish and some regs, and focus on making reads. Because I don't know anything about any of these players, and they don't know anything about me, I don't think. So also recently, just last week, I finally got around to getting Poker Tracker 4 and the Coffee HUD, and they're both great tools. Actually, the Coffee HUD's pretty amazing. I'm still learning how to use it. I'm not sure I'm making optimal use of it yet, but I'll try to point out relevant stats as they pop up. But the thing about any HUD, and especially one as advanced as the Coffee HUD, that has post-flop statistics for lots of fairly specific situations. The thing about anything like that is that it takes a while for those stats to converge, right? You need something of a hand sample before a lot of them are going to be as useful as they can be. So when you're playing against new players, like I am today, and especially against fish who you might not ever even really get much of a sample against, it's really important to start using all of the information you have available to you as quickly as possible, and you not just rely on your HUD to make reads. Like if you can play just a couple hands and then have some idea about how your opponent thinks about the game, then you'll be able to play a lot more profitably. Now, of course, if you start making broad, sweeping generalizations and lots of assumptions about your opponent's play off of just a couple hands, then you might end up being wrong. And in general, you definitely have to be willing to adjust your reads as you get more information. But still, more often than not, it's going to be a lot better than not having any information at all about what your opponent's doing. All right, so for example, I'll be reading hand history posts on strategy forums or something, and the post will start out saying something like we're 10 hands into the match and readless, and then they give a hand history and ask what they should do. But the fact is that they sort of the hero in that hand already messed up a long time ago. There's really no excuse for getting 10 hands into a match and not having at least some idea of what your opponent's doing, right? And as you get better at this, of course, maybe you'll have quite a good idea. So I'm going to have my HUD up, and I'll make some use of it, but what I really want to focus on in this video is how to start making reads on opponents after just a hand or two. Okay, so before I get started, actually, let me just go over a quick example to make it clear sort of what I mean. Alright, so check out this hand. So suppose we're in the first hand of a sit and go, hyper turbo against an unknown. We're in the big blind. We defend the min raise with king 8 offsuit. The flop goes check check. Sort of we flop top pair on a fairly dry board, that is, and it goes check check. And we lead the turn, and he folds. So okay, great. So first of all, he raises button. Not all players do that. Some players fold button, some players 3x, some players limp. So the fact that he's raising buttons tells you he's somewhat more likely than otherwise, to be familiar with solid, standard, sort of loose aggressive button play. And certainly if he raises a few buttons in a row, I'm going to go ahead and assume that he has, some sort of reggish small blind opening strategy. So then we get this flop. It's something sort of weak and static, dry, you might say. It could be king 5 deuce, maybe even a paired board. We check the flop, pretty standard, I think, and villain checks back. Then we lead the turn and he folds. So, okay, it's pretty easy not to think about this hand very much, right? Like our play was kind of super standard, and our opponent didn't do anything particularly outrageous. So it's pretty easy just to sort of move on. But actually, we need to think a bit. We need to think a lot about this hand because it's all we have on our opponent so far. And actually, he probably played very non-standardly here. What does he do this with? I mean, the fact is that on this board, most players, or at least standard players, are going to be c-betting here with a lot of their range. And if they don't, it's probably because they have a two or ace high or something that's going to be able to call a bet on this turn, right? So if he did check back this flop and then folded the turn, he must have played something non-standardly. So general ideas we might have about our opponent after this hand is that he's not particularly not particularly sticky. He doesn't really look for reasons to make plays for pots. But more specifically, he might not even have a very good understanding of the whole concept of continuation betting, or at least he might not have a good understanding of board texture. He might not recognize this as a good board to c-bet, right? And so that's the sort of big picture thing, the sort of big picture read that we can't really get from a HUD. However, it's one that we can use in a lot of spots. Like if the very next hand he check raises us on, or not the next hand, but in any hand he check raises us on this sort of board, we can discount the possibility that he's identifying the board as a good one to play back on, because he's probably just not thinking about that sort of stuff. So, and additionally, if he doesn't really know anything about even sort of dry flop texture, which is maybe the simplest sort of issue in board texture, he almost certainly isn't thinking too much about how cards that come on later streets are interacting with players' ranges. So that's that can influence our bluffing decisions on later streets. If we're trying to get him off of a pair and a scare card comes, we might not expect him to even recognize it as a scare card in the same way that some other players might, and that sort of thing. Right. So yeah, I'm a really big proponent of paying attention to every decision that an opponent makes, early on in a sit and go. And of course, if you see a showdown, that's gold. But even if you don't see a showdown, like in this case, you can think about all the hands that he could have possibly played that way, and then what it may have meant for his strategy if he did have those hands, right? Like in this case here, where he checked back a dry board and then folded to a turn lead. Two main things are most likely. Either he had, sort of weak showdown value, like a 2 or ace high, and he folded to the turn bet, or he had air and checked back this flop and then folded to a turn bet. So if he had checked back ace high or a pair of 2s or whatever, then in that case, maybe he still could be sort of our stereotypical solid, maybe even 2+2 kind of player, but he's somewhat more on the tight passive side, certainly, and we can maybe run him over a bit. Or in the second case, where he checked back with air and then folded the turn bet, all that stuff that we said about him not understanding c-betting and board textures is probably true, right? So I think the second option is more likely there, since there's probably more, a lot more guys out there that fall into that category. But the point is that something weird happened in this hand. There's pretty much two options, and one of them is almost certainly the case, and we should keep those in mind, because in the next hand maybe we'll get an additional piece of information that'll help us identify which of those two weird things actually happened, and then we'll have a read. Okay, great. So let's get into some hands. Okay, so in this game I'm playing Orinoco 31. I believe I actually sat first in this game, so he sat second. Maybe he's a fish, hard to say. I am going to start opening 2.5x. It's sort of my standard 75 big blinds deep. This is Revolution's turbo format, so we are starting out 75 big blinds deep. And I think 2.5x just works pretty well. I certainly switch to min raising pretty often if my opponent's kind of spewy, and I switch to 3xing pretty often too if he's not 3-betting me very much, and especially if he's either folding to a lot of c-bets or whatnot. Then I can just make the pot bigger pre-flop and then win a bigger pot on later streets. But I think 2.5x is a good sort of intermediate to start out with. So here I make a standard open. I make a pretty standard c-bet on a board where I think I'll find a lot of good barreling cards, and I think it sort of misses his defending range in general. And then he min raises, so I'm getting really good odds with a decent hand. Again, there's some decent turn cards for me, and I can have the best hand a medium amount here, or at least enough to, I think, make a call on the flop. So I do. And then I think he continues here. Yeah, something like 200 and 300, and at this point, I think I have a fold. So what does this maybe sort of say about our opponent, and what is he doing this with here? So I mean, it's hard to say exactly. Generally, I would say he either can break it down. So either he has a jack, a 3, a 4, or maybe a straight draw, or maybe some sort of air, right? Um, if he's doing this with air, he might be the kind of guy to identify this is a good board to play back on. And in particular, there are guys out there who do this. His bet sizing is sort of the most interesting thing here, of course, right? If he just made a normal check raise, it wouldn't be quite as puzzling. But there are guys who make really small raises on early streets to sort of find out where they're at, and then continue bigger. There's some regs who make small bets on early streets, and then if you sort of show weakness, they'll maybe even overbet on later streets to try to get you off your weekends. So he could be the kind of guy to do that. Or he could play his jacks like this, or his stronger hands even. He could see this as a he could properly identify this as sort of a dry board and think that a min raise is the best way to get value, and then go bigger on a later street to try to get more money because there's a lot left behind. But definitely a non-standard hand, and we should sort of try to figure out what he's doing this with. My immediate adjustment to that, by the way, I think, is to go ahead and start min raising. So basically, whenever I sort of identify my opponent as one who's maybe sort of spewy, or maybe just putting a lot of money in post flop in general, it's definitely going to motivate me to min raise pre-flop, to build smaller pots pre-flop. And that's not just for like the simple reason that you might imagine that I want to lose more money when they play back, but it's also a little more fundamentally that the whole reason that I raise pre-flop is to try to like build a bigger pot in position so that I can play more profitably in position, right? I'm going to end up winning bigger fractions of the pot when I'm in position post-flop. So I want to make sure those pots are bigger so that I win more money. But if my opponent's very happy putting in a lot of money post-flop in general, then it's not as necessary for me to start building bigger pots pre-flop. So I think against this guy, I'm going to immediately just start min raising my button because it's possible that he's sort of spewy. Yeah, great. So here I guess make a pretty standard min raise, pretty standard c-bet. I am taking notes. Important to take notes. On this turn here, I think it's like an okay spot to barrel in general. We turn some outs. We could possibly get him off of either sort of a chop or a 10 or something. And especially by the river, like there's a lot of stuff that turn combo draws here or whatnot, and it's going to call once or call twice rather. Call the turn and then fold the river. On the other hand, I don't really like making big moves on on the first hand, or the second hand that is, especially, well, the first hand we sort of identified him as a possibly spewy player. In the second hand, we don't really know much more than that, so it's not clear that bluffing him is going to be a good strategy in general. And this card it certainly isn't a good one to two barrel without putting in a third barrel, because I expect him to call twice a whole lot. So I do have some showdown value and some out, so I just check back and try to realize equity. So here he goes full pot on this river. So hand reading. So basically, all of his pairs, if he flopped an ace or a 10, they're still pairs, obviously. If he flopped any kind of straight draw, either hit the king, if it was like a king jack 10 or king queen jack sort of straight draw, or hit the 9 if it was sort of a 8-9 sort of straight draw. And also the flush draws I got there. So basically what I'm saying is that if he check called the flop with any of the draws or any of the pairs, then he has a made hand here. It's impossible for him to get to this river without a made hand unless he check called with pretty much nothing. And this isn't a board where there's overcards, obviously, right? So sometimes when people check call the flop on a board where the highest card is fairly low, then they can just have bare overcards. But people much less often check call flops with bare undercards, right? So basically, it's pretty much impossible for him to have air on this river, and so when he leads full pot, he's presumably value betting, right? So what we can take away from here is that his full pot river bet, we're going to fold, so we're not going to see a showdown, but it's very likely that his full pot river bet is a value type bet. So if he bets some other sizing on different rivers, then maybe we'll be able to identify that as a bluff or whatnot. The fact that he can't be really, well, he could be turning a hand into a bluff here, but it's much more likely this bet is a value bet and it's full pot. So our tentative read is that full pot bets are value. Hope that came off clearly. Okay, so he does limp a button. I think we have a fairly standard check call here with a pair. He pots again, like really quickly. And I'm gonna fold. Basically, I just think enough of my range I have enough of a continuing range here that I don't need to be too worried about getting bluffed. I do definitely have aces in my range here. We're fairly deep. I can check back weak aces pre-flop and call on that flop, and then get to the turn there with an ace. The thing is though that it's sort of weird that what he's representing. The board there, which was 7-3 deuce ace, to go pot or no, to bet medium size and then go pot is kind of weird. Like, is he limping aces? Maybe. If he's limping aces and stabbing a flop, it's possible, but both of those things can be discounted. Is he potting the turn with a 7? A lot of people aren't, or a 3 even. I mean, a lot of people aren't potting the turn with middle pairs there. Can he have two pair there on the 7-3 deuce flop? It's pretty hard to have a lot of those two pairs. Some of them will fold pre-flop. 7 deuce, 7-3, 3 deuce. All those combos should be folding pre-flop a lot. So again, that's a spot where it's hard to say exactly what happened, but something weird happened. Presumably, there's a very small set of hands for which his play there would have been standard. So thinking about those spots and trying to figure out what he does can be enlightening, even if we don't see a showdown. So here he calls us again. I think I decided to barrel here, and that sort of goes against the read that he is just sort of spewy, and maybe it's not a good idea to put a lot of money in the pot against him without a hand. But basically, I kind of get the feeling that he can end up here with a lot of stuff, like possibly a lot of even worse hands than me, or a lot of unpaired stuff, on ace high stuff. Right? The fact is that he's called out of position every time so far, and he's never folded to a c-bet. And this is the kind of board that if your opponent is sort of loose, you can imagine him floating a lot. And so if I can get him off his air on this turn, then I think that might even be enough to make it a profitable bet. And furthermore, there's certainly some legitimate draws that he can now fold now that the board's double paired, or he could even call with a worse hand occasionally. Certainly spots where it's possible that your opponent could call with a worse hand, whereas they'll probably lead the turn as a bluff, or lead the river as a bluff after the turn goes check check. Are good spots to barrel, because that's a little extra value that you can find from those barreling situations. We do get called again, and an ace on the river here. I don't think it's a great spot to continue at this point. The fact is, a lot of fish are going to call for the chop here anyway, so we don't really have much to gain from trying to bluff against those guys. And then at this point, after he's called a couple times, there's a decent chance that he either has an ace or better. So let's get some information from Showdown. Pocket fours. Okay, pocket fours. So I play a little bit higher on merge, but I think the games on Revolution might be softer. So our read at this point, our read, or what we can take away from this hand basically, is that our opponent cannot necessarily read his own hand very well. He apparently didn't realize he was counterfeited on that turn. So an unfortunate river for us, I guess. But yeah, so certainly at this point we shouldn't really expect our opponent to have a very good understanding of things like board texture and how later cards interact with ranges and things like that. So we should try to keep that sort of stuff out of our exploitative thought processes. Here, make a standard raise. I think a little over pot is probably best. 100. So I see bet this board. Again, I think it's really standard, just a dry board that I'm going to have a lot of barreling opportunities on, since I have a lot of backdoor draws and so on. not too much to say there. Our bet sizing on this turn, I guess, is kind of interesting. So I bet 250, which gives me just under a pot size bet on the river. I kind of think that I should have gone somewhat bigger, because I think, well, I might be sort of results oriented. If I remember correctly, I think he folded the river. But I want to say that, if he has any of the draws, he seems like the kind of guy who's going to call again and then fold river if he misses. And we want to get as much value out of those situations. And of course, even sort of his weaker value hands, we can do a little bit better. If he feels committed, because if we're only like shoving 60 or 70% of the pot, I think we're going to call a lot more than if we're shoving right up on 100% of the pot, 90 or whatever. Anyway, actually that river there was kind of interesting too. Let me go back. Right, so we get an ace on the river, which is kind of a terrible card for us, right? In addition to strength, it improves our range a lot, so it makes him less likely to call. And also, it's possible he has an ace here at sometimes, either a flush draw or a gut shot or sort of whatever. He seems kind of not too predictable. So it's kind of a bad card for us in general. However, I think jamming is still best, or at least value betting. I could have gone smaller, I suppose, to try to get value from just sort of whatever. But I think check calling is just missing too much value. And it's not clear if he's going to have a lot of bluffs here anyway. I think he has more weak value hands. I certainly think there's more 2s and 3s in his range than in some people's once we get to the river that way. So here, again, I think it's sort of a standard c-bet. I could imagine not c-betting just because I don't expect to get too many folds at this point from this player. He has yet to fold to a c-bet, and this certainly isn't a board where people fold, or that I would expect him to fold more than average. So I think that might have been a mistake, that c-bet there. Here he goes full pot, and again, it's hard to say if he just likes the pot button or if that was a value bet. Certainly he could have gotten to the river that way with a good number of value hands. Standard min raise. He still hasn't 3-bet us at all, so again, that's sort of an argument for raising bigger sometimes, because he can we play bigger pots in position and we don't have the risk associated with getting 3-bet. However, he's still not, he's letting us build perfectly large pots even if we don't put in much pre-flop, so there's not really any great reason to. So I'm going to keep min-raising, and min-raising a wide range too. I don't, he's not playing back in a way that's like making me want to tighten up my opening range, really. At least not when we're still, pretty deep. So he leads here. I'm open-ended. I can't imagine that raising is going to be. Again, I don't think my money is coming from making this guy fold, basically. My money is going to come from, as sort of boring as it is, it's going to come from making hands and value betting. So yeah, it's certainly important to think about where your money comes from against opponents, and then go there. Okay, so I c-bet here, or I bet here rather, when I make my one card straight. I get check min raised. Again, it's not entirely clear if our opponent is great at reading boards, but I think most people know that there's a 4 straight here, and so I think he represents either a straight himself, either a 10 or a king 10, or some kind of bluff. It's hard for him to have bluffs after he led this flop, I think, right? Because it's hard. Anything he led with, he sort of hit the 8, or I guess he could have a bear king high, maybe. Anyway, there's not that many bluffs in his range, so I think he's either doing something weird, or we're chopping, or I'm getting cooler and he has king 10. So I don't really see any value in re-raising anyway. The pot is such that I can get out, even if I flat and he checks the river, I can put all the money in, or get my value on the river anyway. So I think a call here is sort of the only decent play. And then we get sort of a blank river, and our opponent goes big, and I call. It's sort of like a very nutted line, right? Like the check min raise turn, go big on the river. but I think I'm just chopping enough to make it a profitable call. And sometimes he does something weird too. So if he shows up with king 10, it's just a cooler. Okay, but here in fact he showed up with the top pair no kicker. So very interesting. I actually had forgotten kind of how bad this guy was. I didn't mean to show a video of a huge fish, but anyway, he played queen 3 this way. So yeah, so it's important to keep in mind his pre-flop ranges. Queen 3 is not a super loose call, but this deep it's probably too loose. He led this flop with top pair, so we'll keep that in mind. It's not necessarily something I would have expected too much because I don't necessarily expect him to recognize this board texture. So obviously leading this sort of board texture is kind of a standard play, but this guy isn't somebody who we had identified as particularly good at understanding board texture. So I didn't necessarily put that into his range. And then the other part of his donking strategy that we can see from the HUD is that in fact he's never folded to a c-bet. So when people fold to a lot of c-bets, I tend to give their donks some credit, and when they don't donk at all, then maybe I think they have more strong hands to face c-bets. But here he's never